hour actually. So what I would like to do is give Sam and Tom up to 20 minutes for each presentation. I'll just have a few brief comments at the end, and then we can all discuss the two papers. So Sam, you won the coin toss. I didn't show it to you, but you won the coin toss. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Oh, it was muted. Okay.
Good.
So I'd like to share my slides first. Okay, can everybody see the slides?
Good.
Okay, thank you. My name is Sam Kang, working at Marquette University. And I just graduated Rutgers University, so that's why my PPT slides use Rutgers PPT. I hope it's fine for you guys. So this paper is based on my dissertation, and it basically examines the effects of pay for performance on job satisfaction and performance at the individual level as well as at the organizational level. And I think this topic, pay for performance, is quite interesting because of many reasons. But one of the reasons is that nearly 90% of organizations in the United States use some form of pay for performance practices. And it includes public organizations like government. So maybe in the private section, the number will be higher than 90%. But interestingly, only 20% of employers in North America think that pay for performance is effective, which means that 80% of managers do not think pay for performance really work in their organization. And then what's going on? So I thought that there's something in these numbers. And I thought about why pay for performance is not that effective as people think. So based on both economic and psychological perspectives, I tried to answer to this question. When does the use of pay for performance enhances job satisfaction, which may in turn positively affect performance outcomes? Okay, so first, I suggest that pay for performance is not always positively or negatively affect job satisfaction. Okay? Think about a situation that, okay, your compensation or salary will be based on your performance, 100%. How would you feel? Okay? People will, feel it differently depending on their situation, depending on the organization's, overall strategy and the communication and etc. But according to self-determination theory, there are some important social contexts that determine the direction of the effects of pay for performance, which are autonomy, competence, and relatedness support. I don't want to explain, everything about this theory, but what this theory basically suggests is that under certain conditions, pay for performance may positively affect employee attitudes because employees may feel that, oh, I can earn more money if I work harder, right? So, and that's good. So I will work harder. I want to do this job and I will make more money. So they will be happy about pay for performance. So that is one possibility. And many managers may hope this situation. But there is another possible scenario, which is that employees can perceive that, oh, my organization use pay for performance as a means of control. They want to make profit, so they use pay for performance, and because of that, I have to do this job harder, and I have to do my job longer if I want to earn more money, right? So in this situation, employees may feel that pay for performance is bad for them, and they will not be happy about that. So these two scenarios are possible, but there is a very important context, situational context. Okay? Those are autonomy support, competence support, and relatedness support. Okay, what that mean? For example, let's take a competence support as an example. If organization use pay for performance along with a very extensive training program, okay? So they use pay for performance practice, but at the same time, they tell the employees that, okay, we will train you, okay? Let me know, we will help you to do your job better, so that you can do your job better and you can earn more money. In this situation, employees are less likely to perceive that their organization use pay for performance in order to squeeze the employees. They are likely to perceive that our organization really care about the employee support. So they are likely to think that, oh, it's a good chance to improve their performance and earn more money. But on the other hand, if organization doesn't support employees at all, but they use pay for performance, then employees are more likely to perceive that the organization just want to make money in the expense of workers.
Sam?
Yes, please.
You're going to have to move through this more quickly if you want to have any hope of getting to your results.
Okay, thank you. So how many minutes I have?
You have now about 12 minutes.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. So I will move quickly. So basically, I suggest that there will be interaction effect between pay for performance and this organizational context, autonomy support, competence support, and relatedness support, okay, on job satisfaction. And then I suggest that job satisfaction might mediate this interaction effect on performance outcomes at the individual level as well as at the organizational level. So I will skip this. So this is the overall research model. Right. So I will skip this because this is basically So I used two different data sets to test this model. Study one test this model at the individual level, and study two use organizational level data to study this model at the organizational level. Okay. So first data. Okay. I use the survey data from R&D workers. So this is a multi-level data. At the individual level, the number of observation was more than 600, and the number of units were about 50. The characteristics of the sample and pay for performance intensity was measured like this. Okay, what percentage of your the salary is based on performance-based pay? So this is the continuous variable. This is not a dummy variable, whether the organization, asking whether the organization use pay for performance or not. Then job satisfaction, autonomy support, competence support, and relatedness support were measured like this. I will skip this. Okay. And because it was, Thomas, do you have any?
Oh, sorry, I was adjusting my screen.
Oh, okay. Because it was R&D workers, employee performance was measured as by employee creative performance, and I control the number of variables. And these are the results. And as you can see here, I found significant interaction effect between pay for performance and autonomy support, and pay for performance and related need support. So what this means, as you can see here, this is the simple plot. So when the organization provides a high level of autonomy support and related need support, then pay for performance positively related to employee job satisfaction. And job satisfaction was also positively related to employees' creative performance. So this is the indirect effect under different conditions. So when autonomy support and related need support was high, pay for performance had a positive and significant indirect effect on employees' performance through job satisfaction. Okay, so I test the same model at the organizational level. So this data is nationally representative data, and this data is also multi-source data from HR managers, employees, and also it's a longitudinal data. So pay for performance was measured by the proportion of individual or organizational performance related pay. I want to point out here is that in study 2, I distinguish it between individual based pay for performance and organizational based pay for performance. You know the differences between individual pay for performance and organizational performance, right? So, and then job satisfaction, autonomy, competence, related need support. Organizational performance was measured by ROA, and then these are some controls. Okay, and surprisingly, I found basically the same result. As you can see here, pay for individual performance had an interaction effect with autonomy support and related need support. But when it comes to pay for organizational performance, it has no interaction effect on job satisfaction. So these are the simple plots. So when the organization provides a high level of autonomy support and related need support, pay for performance had a positive impact on employees' job satisfaction. Okay. Similarly, job satisfaction had a positive impact on subsequent organizational financial performance. And the pattern of the indirect effect was basically the same. Okay. When organization provides high level of autonomy and related need support, pay for individual performance had a significant indirect effect on organizational performance through collective job satisfaction. But when it comes to pay for organizational performance, it had no the moderating effect. It generally had a positive impact on organizational performance. So which suggests that when it comes to pay for organizational performance, employees are less likely to feel that the organization use incentives to squeeze the employees and maximize profit, maybe. Okay, so this is the conclusion of my study, and yeah, thank you. I think you are muted, Dale.
Okay, so I'm muted, but no longer. Thank you very much. That was interesting. I think we'll now turn to Thomas, who has a paper that's more in my wheelhouse. I'm quite interesting. Also emailed me to say he had new results. I hope, I'm sure they're exciting. So I'll turn things over to him.
Thank you. Can everybody see my slides just fine?
Yes, good.
Delightful. All right then. So if I'm speaking too fast, please speak up. I used to be a camp counselor, so force of habit. The state of the minimum wage literature right now, I think it helps to start by getting an understanding of what is motivating this paper. The central question that I'm trying to address is what is the employment or disemployment effects of the minimum wage? And there are four basic camps that study this question. One seeks to identify whether or not there's an employment effect by looking at regional differences and using county fixed effects. This is in the same lineage of Card and Kruger's seminal work, where they take New Jersey and Pennsylvania counties and compare employment rates. This is similarly in the line of Allegretto et al. And these papers tend to find that there is no significant unemployment effects caused by the minimum wage. Second is the two-way fixed effect approach. Whereas the first approach limits geography to areas that are right along a state border, where you would see a difference in one wage compared to another, the two-way fixed effect does not make this conditionality. So it measures employment throughout the state over time. And this is in the lineage of papers like Meir and West, and they find a statistically significant negative effect. The third group is a synthetic control approach, where counties are controlled for based on counties that are similar in terms of the teen employment levels. So for example, a county in Alaska would be compared to a county in Georgia, plus a county in Florida, plus a county in North Dakota, if they all have similar teen employment levels. And this lineage tends to find also a significant negative effect of employment in response to a minimum wage. Finally, there is a new approach brought in from Segnitz et al. Using what's called the bunching estimator. And this is going to be the basis for my paper. The bunching estimator is similar to a triple difference effect, but rather than looking at difference in difference based on counties that are across a state border, like Allegretto does, there are three levels of difference. The change in the minimum wage over time within states, the difference in the minimum wage over time between states, and the change in employment along different places of the wage distribution within states as well. And we'll review this in a moment because this becomes the basis of my paper. One issue with this literature is that there's not a lot of attention given to exemptions to the minimum wage. This minimum wage is usually treated as if it's a single number. There have been some papers that study when there are differences in the minimum wage or exemptions to this minimum wage. Freeman, Gray, and Akowski go through the yellow pages and they ask a series of firms whether or not they use a minimum wage that was established that was a special exemption for student workers. Spriggs does a similar approach where he tracks different franchise locations in states that had a backstop for this student exemption to the minimum wage and those who did not. And both groups tend to find that although there is this exemption to the minimum wage, it's usually not utilized because most employers thought it was too much of a hassle. Similarly, Newmark and Washer do a paper in 1992 that ostensibly covers the employment effects of the subminimum wage. But if you actually read their empirical strategy, they don't have any bespoke effect for this exemption to the minimum wage. They just have an indicator variable for someone who reports a wage that's equal to or less than the minimum wage and groups it all together. There is some study of the tipped minimum wage as well from Allegretto and Nadler and Evan and McPherson. And the difference with the tipped minimum wage is a different minimum wage to be paid to workers who traditionally earn tips and those who do not. That tends to be using the regression discontinuity method and the two-way fixed effects method. And Allegretto finds no statistically significant disemployment effects. Evan does, but neither of which are using semi-parametric methods. And also, there are more exemptions than just tipped workers. So I'm going to introduce some special terminology in order to differentiate my results from the results of the predecessors that I have mentioned. The federal minimum wage is the minimum wage defined by the Federal Labor Standards Act, or the Fair Labor Standards Act. The state minimum wage is the minimum wage that's defined on a state-by-state basis. The effective minimum wage is the maximum between those two. So if, for example, North Dakota has a state minimum wage of 0, they still are bound by an effective minimum wage equal to the federal minimum wage of $7.25. Next is a term that I'm introducing called the headline minimum wage, which is the minimum wage that's binding to most workers. This is the minimum wage that in, for example, Minnesota or in Minneapolis, just passing a citywide minimum wage of $15, that minimum wage is binding for most workers, but there are some exceptions. In the exceptions case, I would call that the sub-minimum wage, or a minimum wage that's given for a lower tier. In some cases, this serves as a backstop. So, for example, in the 90s, the difference between the headline and sub-minimum wage in Minnesota was based on whether or not a firm was earning more than $500,000 in revenues in a given year or less than $500,000 in revenue. In Oklahoma, there's a head count distinction. And in Nevada, there's a distinction for those who work in the healthcare industry and those who don't. The sub-minimum wage provides a backstop to make sure that there is some baseline minimum wage, even in the case of policy exemptions. Some examples of sub-minimum wage includes commensurate wages for persons with disabilities, J-1 visas, and small firm exemptions that I previously mentioned. Next, to establish just some general trends in wages over time, I'm using Minnesota as my base case because I am from Minnesota. We see a general increase in wages over time in nominal terms. Real terms, all of the real controls that I'm going to use for this paper are with respect to 2016 dollars. So we see a general increase in the minimum wage over time, but a lot of these increases were made in the late 90s, and we have seen a flattening of that increase since. With respect to wage percentiles, similarly, we see a slow general increase over time, but in real terms, that doesn't seem to keep up. We see a little bit of an increase in the late 90s, but a general flattening of the 25th percentile of wages in Minnesota over time. In terms of distribution of wages, this is for 2016 specifically. We see an almost log normal distribution of wages. The point that I want to draw your attention to, however, is in the chart on the right. There are a few spikes that we see. We see a notable spike at $10. We see a notable spike around $9.50, which is the this middle spike here, and that represents what was the headline minimum wage for Minnesota in 2016. And if you go a couple spaces to the left at $7.75, you'll see another spike. This was the sub-minimum wage in 2016 for Minnesota workers. I would also draw your attention to the fact that there are wage bins, there are people who are earning the wages in between those two numbers. So not only does the sub-minimum wage create a concentration of those earning this sub-minimum wage, it also creates headroom for people to earn wages in between those two wage rates. In terms of the ratio between the headline and the sub, for a long time they were, the sub-minimum wage was non-binding, but recently, given these changes in the headline minimum wage with respect to the sub-minimum wage, there's about a difference of a 1.3 ratio. So the headline minimum wage is about 30% higher than the sub-minimum wage. And to kind of put more of a distributional spin on things, the chart on the right is showing the ratio between the 25th percentile and the headline minimum wage over time. So again, we see some early gains in the late 90s, but a flattening and actually a decrease in this distributional effect over time. Now, to justify why I'm studying the sub-minimum wage, there are people who earn this, who we find. If we look at the distribution of the number of people who report a wage that is less than or equal to the headline minimum wage, we see in the neighborhood of 10%. We see, again, this U-shaped curve over time. We also see a non-trivial percentage, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2%, of people reporting a wage that is less than or equal to the sub-minimum wage. Now, how much of this is people reporting their wage in earnest and they're actually earning a sub-minimum wage? How much of it is reporting error? And how much of it is capturing some kind of wage theft? I don't have the answer to that question. Unfortunately, I just have to take it as granted that their reported wage is as they report. Although one of the things that I plan to do in future versions of this paper is to see if we see significant bunching around the subminimum wage under the assumption that there's no reason why reporting error should be clustered around the subminimum wage tier. Now to justify the bunching estimator. So one benefit of the bunching estimator is that it's going to be a semi-parametric estimator of the labor supply curve. The theory that's going to be feeding into this bunching estimator is that it motivates SegNets et al. To estimate the effects of the minimum wage without having to restrict their geography. So they're using the entire state when they do this. The Lagrangian that we face here is a firm that is a cost minimizer, but the variable costs faced by the firm are just labor cost. So capital is fixed in their model. The costs that they face are based on the different wage groups that they employ, and these wage groups are determined by their relative productivity. And one assumption that they make for the sake of simplicity is that they order people by their marginal productivity J, and they presume that marginal productivity would be a one-to-one mapping onto wages in the absence of monopsony. But this J just becomes an indicator, becomes a way for them to keep track of different productivity levels. To the right-hand side, we see the firm's production function. SegNets et al. Assumes just a constant elasticity of scale production function, where each kind of labor is considered complementary, and they're all producing one single kind of good. But there are different relative factors, phi, that contribute their relative share of the production process. And sigma is the relative scaling factor for each of these inputs. If you take the first order conditions, this creates the following Hicksian demand function, where the labor demand for one particular group is given by this top equation. And by introducing a minimum wage, you create a segmentation of the cost function for workers who would have a wage that would be clearing, or their J would be less than the minimum wage, and those who have a wage that would be above that. And so this segmentation expresses itself in a difference of the cost function. And by introducing a minimum wage, you see a difference of the cost function, and that may create a difference in the demand for labor if there is no monopsony power. The way that then the bunching estimator operates is if there is an increase in the minimum wage, you would expect there to be all of the people who were earning below that wage rate. They would be in this area in red. And you would see that they are no longer able to be paid below the minimum wage, so they would have to be paid the minimum wage. They would move from the red section to a spike in the blue section. And if there is monopsony power, and if there is no disemployment effects from the minimum wage, the area of those two regions are equal. And if there is no such monopsony power, and there is an unemployment effect caused by the minimum wage, then the area of those two regions will be different. So they define the spike and the tail respectively. The spike is the area just above the new minimum wage, and the tail is that region that you saw to the left side before the minimum wage was implemented. And it's estimated as the sum of the labor demand for each of these J bins within a certain region. So the spike represents the area from the lowest wage to the minimum wage. B represents that same region, but in the absence of a minimum wage regime. One notational difference you'll see is that the cost functions differ because the top cost function accounts for a minimum wage, whereas the lower one does not. Oh, I left an M in there. There's not supposed to be an M in the cost function for B.
Keep moving.
Yep. So this creates an estimation for the relative employment, the relative elasticity of changes in employment, where S represents the share of minimum wage workers with respect to their costs in respect to total cost. And when you have only two regions, this S can end up canceling out when you estimate your employment effects parametrically. But when we add different regions with 2 minimum wages, this S doesn't just cancel out algebraically, and I'll show that in a moment. So I'm going to introduce the ability to be paid the subminimum wage. Not everyone is eligible for the subminimum wage. Let alpha equal 1 if you are in one of those groups that could be paid below the minimum wage, like J1 visa workers, students, or those with a disability, and alpha equals 0 for those who are not eligible for this. Similarly, let M with an underbar be the subminimum wage and M with an overbar be the headline minimum wage. So if we don't account for this minimum wage, we would assume that the area between B and A would represent the entire employment effects of the minimum wage. However, if you have 2 regions that are actually spikes, then you may be estimating A incorrectly. And therefore, your estimations of both employment levels would be incorrect if you don't account for the substitution between those 2 types of workers. That is to say, if you just presume that both spikes add together to be the spike that you measure with just 1 minimum wage, you're ignoring those who are clearing in between. And those represent a reduction in the distortionary effects of the minimum wage, if there is one. Similarly, I can skip that for now. So this changes the cost function, because rather than having cost by just 2 regions, those below the minimum wage and those above the minimum wage, you now have those in between the subminimum wage and the headline minimum wage. This creates a difference of the cost function. The top is the cost function for exempt workers, and the bottom is the cost function for those without the exemption, but they're all still being included in the same overall production function. Each of these 3 subsections are representing the 3 different wage areas, those who are below the subminimum wage, those who are between the subminimum and the headline minimum, and those who are above the headline minimum. Similarly, taking the first order conditions, we get a series of labor demands similar to what we saw with Segnitz et al. The important difference, however, is that the employment spike that we would be measuring is going to need to include the employment spike, some measure of the other employment spike. So looking at this bottom term here, we have the employment spike at the headline minimum wage. This is a function of some of the people who are exempt for that minimum wage. So this top term, I don't suppose you can see my mouse, but the second line out of the 3 lines in employment spike at headline minimum, that's including those who may be exempt, but whose wages are just exactly at the headline minimum. So even though they could be earning less than the minimum wage, were it not for their productivity, they're going to be artificially counted as being non-exempt when they feasibly could be exempt. Similarly, if you look at the spike of the subminimum wage, there is a term that includes the relative share of those who are above the minimum wage. So there is some importance to estimate the cross-price elasticity of these different types of workers, and ignoring this distinction would lead to a biased estimation of the employment effects. So this creates a series of testable hypotheses as to whether or not exempt workers and non-exempt workers are seen as substitutes, complements, or unrelated to each other. And this is where the empirics come in. The Segnitz et al. Paper uses the CPS outgoing rotation group, where it measures hourly wage and employment status. My version is going to use a newer set of years, so I think they only go through 2016, and I think they start a little bit earlier rather than at 89. I think they start in 85, and they use the NBER version of the CPS. I'm using the Minnesota Population Center version. One difference that they make is that they aggregate these relative wage amounts into quarterly amounts. So even though the CPS is measured monthly, they aggregate the number of persons who are earning different wage amounts into quarterly bins. As mentioned earlier, the wages are controlled for by inflation according to the CPI, and headline and subminimum wage histories are given by Vogel and Zipperer in their GitHub code. In terms of the empirical strategy for the bunching estimator, And unfortunately, I'm going to have to speed through this part because I recognize I'm running out of time. The identifying assumption is that the employment level is broken up by wage bins, which are 25-cent bins that we observe. S is the state, and T is the quarter that someone responds to the CPS. So their Y variable is the ratio between employment and population within a given bin. So if I'm earning $10 exactly or $10.24, I'm going to be counted in the same employment bin. Then there is a set of relative indicator variables that are generated. So for example, if I earn $9, I would be considered 4 bins below the $10 bin. This is helpful because then when there's a change in the minimum wage, you can test for their relative distance from the minimum wage before and after that minimum wage was implemented. The identification assumption is similar to a triple difference estimator, where there's a difference in the minimum wage over time, a difference in the employment within different bins within state, and the difference within the same bin, but across states. And they find no statistically significant disemployment effects from the minimum wage. My model just adds 2 factors to this analysis: the relative share of exempt workers and relative bins for the distance towards the sub-minimum wage. And the problem that I run into is that this wage bin is relatively thin, so a lot of these bins are going to be unpopulated throughout the time period. Also, unfortunately, as Dale alluded to earlier, I found an error in my data. So the Minnesota Population Center CPS had a coding error for hourly wage for the period of time where I downloaded this data. So I've had to completely redo my results, and unfortunately, my empirics section I can no longer trust. So originally, I found also no employment or unemployment effects from the exemptions to the sub-minimum wage, but I can't rely on that anymore because of the misclassification of non-working persons during a certain time period. So my next step is going to be to recalculate this with a corrected version of that employment effect. And I know that I'm over, but this is probably where it's best for me to get off and hand it off back to you, Dale.
Okay, well, let me just see. Yes, I believe things are live. So a couple points. I think first I'll say a couple things about Sam's paper. And the biggest one is I'm not, very nice paper, very well developed. I think you may have some endogeneity between your tenure variable and your job satisfaction variable that would go somewhat like this, is that basically if someone is long tenure, that probably means that they are reasonably or more satisfied than people who are short tenure. And so in this case, in some cases, you have both tenure and job satisfaction as what I would consider to be explanatory variables. And, I'm wondering if basically a lot of your job satisfaction variable isn't actually picking up a tenure effect. So that would be one thing. The other thing, and this probably because I'm trained as an economist as opposed to doing psychometrics or so on, is that I was getting a little confused about additive effects. So you were finding that 2 of your 3 interactions were statistically significant in some cases, but I had a little trouble separating out, given the number of variables you had in your model, which ones were actually changing your estimates and which ones were simply, I said, whether they were purely additive. Actually, this had a lot to do, if I took a close look at your work, some of your R squares suggested your more complex models actually had lower R squares than your less complex models, which is somewhat puzzling, given I take it you're using a flavor of OLS on this. or various flavors of OLS. So I think that those are some things you're going to want to look at. But as I said, I'm not far from expert on this sort of modeling. Turning to Thomas, I enjoyed what you did considerably. I guess a couple things. One is, and especially your PowerPoint, this was a very clear layout of what you've done. So I enjoyed that and going through it. I had read the paper, but this really pulled things together nicely. And I'm sorry about the IPUMs not having all the variables right. I had to go back recently, or actually my PhD student, Matt Hickle, had to go back and say, you seem to be missing some stuff. And so they seem to be very friendly about making changes, but I'm sure that your work will, you'll be able to move forward fairly quickly. A thought or two, mostly on your estimates. Not that in the end they have meaning until you've corrected that, and I would like to see your corrected results. Couple things. One is that it would be good to have your estimates in elasticity form, and you may have them there. In running through quickly, I wasn't quite sure. And that makes them easily comparable. If they are, sorry for my relatively fast read. I think you sent the paper off this morning, but it's a very nice paper. And I think that resolving the empirics, mostly the data issue, is going to be important to making it a very, very nice paper. Another thing is, it was unclear to me in looking at them whether your effects of the subminimum wage were additive to the effects of the headline minimum wage. I like both of your terms there, very nice. Because at the end, I'm taking a look and you're finding no significant effects for the headline minimum wage, but a very, very modest, tiny effect for the subminimum wage, which is interesting of itself. So I think that they're making it clear, is your estimate of the subminimum wage based on essentially a separate coefficient from the headline minimum wage, just so that we know what's going on. I think it'll be more interesting if indeed you're capturing just that subminimum wage effect. Basically, I would say in this field, a 5% significance test is pretty much the standard for determining if something is statistically significant or not. And now I have to put in a plug for myself. You, of course, could read What Does the Minimum Wage Do?, which goes through all of this in discouraging detail. And with your paper and so on, I'm hoping that Paul and I can write an addendum to it and say, what have we learned in the last 5 years? But very good paper. I'll be interested in seeing your final results. So please keep me on your mailing list, Tom.
Thank you.
The floor is now open. I think we can perhaps all unmute and hold up our hands, and I will call on people. Tom.
I have one thought for Sam. So I forget the author of the paper, unfortunately, but I remember some key parts of it. It's a behavioral economics paper about British strawberry pickers who were seasonal workers who were immigrating from Poland. And so these Polish strawberry pickers had a renegotiation of their contracts, and there was a change in productivity after a renegotiation of their contracts, even if the contract didn't apply to them personally. So the productivity of one worker changed after the contract was bargained for someone else. And perhaps this has something to do with Poland being the home of the Solidarity movement, or perhaps it just has to do with general being a person and working in the same spaces as people. But it may be interesting to look at the interpersonal effects of these pay performance in a way where you're looking at how these norms are benchmarked within one location versus how much they're benchmarked based on other cultural factors.
Oh, thank you, thank you. And I would be I think it's very interesting that even if the policy or contract is not applied to someone directly, it can even affect affect someone. That is very interesting. And if you can find the paper and the
I'll go through my old syllabus. It's when I took behavioral econ. That was a few years ago.
Next question. If you hold up your hand, I'll call on you. Not seeing any hands up. I guess we're getting towards the end of the meeting and everyone has to catch their virtual flight. I'll give it another moment. I liked both papers. I was very pleased. Tom's paper was more in my wheelhouse, and I'm now going to have the pleasure of crawling through it at low speed once you have your work done. I do have a question for you, Tom.
Yes.
Which is, how do you know if someone is participating with your classification scheme and household data? They're clearly reporting a wage. So if they report they're disabled and they report a wage, are they automatically in your sort of in your disabled employed category?
Yeah, so this is where it starts to get tricky. I have, because it's using the CPS, I do have indicators as to whether or not someone reports having either mobility issues or cognitive difficulties that limits their ability to work. I also have their wage, so I would be able to see, in spite of that disability, do they earn a wage? And I'm hesitant to try. I'm looking for input, I should say. I'm looking for input as to how to construct the labor demand curve for workers with disability, because I don't want to embed any discrimination into my assumptions, but I do want to be able to detect it if it exists. So, so far, I've just been binning in terms of whether or not they've reported earning below the minimum wage, and I could link them to their change in wages after an increase in the minimum wage or after an increase in the sub-minimum wage. I don't have a good way to differentiate between different classes of workers yet.
Yeah, I mean, all those, for example, with a teenager, and this is somewhat similar, obviously many of the sub-minimum wages are supposedly training wages, so you can be paid a sub-minimum wage for 3 months or 6 months or whatever the federal government allows, and so on. I think it would be good to provide some descriptive statistics of the number of individuals you have in each of these sub-minimum groups, because you've got some states allow firms that earn less than $500,000 or have less than $500,000 in revenue can pay a sub-minimum wage. So it would be very good to see just how many workers that is. You could break it out, you could probably initially break it out by state, but then look at the national figures so we get a better idea of what proportion. You said 10%, but I think it would be good to get an idea of what proportion of all workers fall into these different categories. And that would just be very interesting. I think some opening discussion of that, in part to establish just there are a substantial number of individuals in this group.
One question I have as a follow-up, do you think that the CPS is the correct instrument to do that with? Just because what kind of motivated me along this path was trying to look for administrative data on people who earn the sub-minimum wage and finding it in shambles. So the state agency wasn't talking to the federal agency, and so there wasn't just a uniform list that I could go down and match So that's part of the reason why I'm using CPS data, even though it's worker reported, it's there, whereas it's not there for what I would imagine would be the QCEW side of things. So do you think that the CPS is the best way to do that, or do you have any other thoughts?
I think, there are really two data sets, household data sets you could use. One is the CPS, which is a fine, large household data. The other is the Survey of Income Program Participation, which is fairly hellish to use. I've got it up, it's running. It's not a pleasant thing to get there. So I think you're better off with the CPS. If you have a bit of time, what you might want to do is see if you can get access to the LEHD version, which one would then identify firms in there, so you can know, from there a bit more information about the individual, and that can be attached to QCEW or other data, so you can get a better idea of what the firm that employee is working at looks like. But that'll take you a year and a half to get access to start working with it. So I think for the moment, my own slogan is the CPS earned me tenure. And it's a good data set for doing this sort of work, unless other people have other suggestions on it. Okay. Final point for Sam in that case, which is that looking at your data and so on, where you get it, your data might have some selection bias in it. I forget, you have 70 firms and your universe consisted of somewhat over 600. And I sort of take a look at that and say, that's a, I guess you had you had a very big difference between your possible population and the number of firms. Now, if those firms represent a random selection out of that population, that's good. If they don't, then are these firms fundamentally different in some respects? So you might want to take a look at that and along some information. For example, does it turn out that none of these firms are the 5-person firms or so on? So I think that would be useful in securing the feeling that we can pull information out here that relates to a larger population. Both very good papers. I'm not quite sure how we applaud people here, but good presentations. So I guess you don't quite have to jump on your virtual airplanes, but thank you very much. And a big round of applause for both presenters.
Thank you. Thank you for the great comments, Dale.
Thank you much.
Take care. Let's see. Okay, very good.
Dale, as a parting question,
Yeah.
what theory section do you think I should have cut so that I could have stayed under time?
I think what you have to do is go through, you had a couple pieces in there that, I enjoy, given I had somewhat limited time, I'm going to go back and read it because you're actually putting you're sort of walking through each little piece of it. But I think what you could do to try to stay on time is say, here is the basic model that Cignas and so on use. And this, if we work through this, here's what we come out with. And so you immediately go to there are really, 3 distinct parts to this. And that's what I'm going to be estimating. And so on. And I think that, because it's really hard to move through theory under time pressure.
Sure.
And so, but this worked out okay because as it turned out, you didn't have empirical results. If you had empirical results, I would have been turning bright red in the face because I'm very interested in them. But I like what you've done. I know that, that you've got stuff set up and you can estimate it and it will work out. So that's basically what I'd suggest. But if you send me the PowerPoint, I can write a few things in it because both of you did very good presentations, but I think you have to kind of work backward in them and realize that, you know, and by the way, we were generous because if we had 4 presenters, you each would have had 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So you had a lot of time, but you need to work backwards. And, you know, as you get more practice, you'll get better at this. But remember, what most people care about are 1, an overview of your model, and 2, what you found. And
Sure.
so anyway, but I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your notes.
Okay. Take care. Have a good rest of the meeting.
Have a safe flight.
Yes, exactly. I like that. Take care.